Shamika is a community protection specialist at the Nature Conservancy, where she connects with community leaders, residents, and coalitions in areas dealing with chronic flooding to help build local knowledge and capacity so they can better adapt to the changing coastline. She recently completed her professional science master's in environmental studies at Antioch University of New England with a focus in sustainable development and climate change. And she serves as an executive board member of the Long Island Progressive Coalition and American Society of Adaptation Professionals. She advises the equity work group for the National Adaptation Forum, the People and Society section of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority Climate Impacts Assessment, and the revitalization efforts at Condor Hall in Long Island, New York. Welcome, Shamika. And let me just get our slideshow set up.
I'll just say a quick thank you for ASAP and for Rachel specifically to invite me to speak here today. And since I had all of that awesome introduction from Rachel, I get to skip an entire paragraph of stuff that I usually say. So thank you.
Here for you.
So hi, everyone. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Shamika Hanson, and I work at the Nature Conservancy here in New York as a community protection specialist. I am currently on the land of the Wappinger people up in the Hudson Valley. And if you can switch slides, for anyone who isn't familiar with the Nature Conservancy, as an organization, we're the largest conservation organization in the world, found in over 70 countries. And our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And we do that by focusing on four main priorities, which are tackling climate change, protecting land and water, providing food and water sustainably, and building healthy cities. Next slide, please. So the priority area that myself and the team I work on in New York is tackling climate change. And looking at this category, we can think about this topic in two ways, which is mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation focuses mainly on actions that can be taken to address the root causes of climate change, whereas our New York team is really focused on actions that seek to lower the risks posed to people and places due to the impacts of climate change, or how we can adapt. Next slide. So for us, the impacts of climate change can show up in a variety of ways, from drought to wildfire, depending on where in the world you live. But in New York, flooding is actually projected to be the most harmful and probably the most costly problem that the state will face, with sea level rise projections showing up to 6.3 feet of sea level rise or water in New York City by the year 2100. It's imperative we really start thinking about putting thoughtful measures in place to make communities be statewide resilient. Next slide. So though 2100 seems a long way away, the time to act is really now. As we know, it takes a long time to plan and implement things. And so the state is already experiencing many of the increases in extreme weather due to climate change that we thought we would see. And since September of 2010, New York has actually experienced 11 weather disasters, including severe storms, tornadoes, floods, tropical storms, snow, ice storms, and droughts. And in coastal areas alone, there's about $3 trillion worth of property currently at risk. And every person in New York State lives in a county that has been affected by at least one of these named weather disasters over the past 12 years. Next slide. So we found that it's very clear that these events will continue to occur, putting both people in some natural habitats at risk. But we have seen nature serve as a natural guard or a buffer for helping to protect many people and places. And our team's really been working to identify ways that communities can think about how they can implement adaptation measures locally. And so even during Hurricane Sandy, wetlands prevented $565 million in flood damages in New York and New Jersey alone. And the wetlands in front of the properties actually reduced the annual flood losses by an average of 16% and up to 70% in some locations. Next slide, please. So with nature being this really cool buffer, we wanted to consider a different hierarchical approach to flood adaptation. And instead of defending and accommodating and then retreating away from coastlines or riverine areas, our climate adaptation team is actually proposing that we instead think about this approach backward. And so start by protecting our natural floodplains, then retreating from areas where floodplains can be restored, and then accommodating for water by raising homes or other infrastructure where necessary, and then finally defending in place using hard infrastructure or other options such as seawalls to protect ourselves. Next slide. So ideally, communities would have the opportunity to enjoy the many benefits of nature, from open space for activities such as bird walking to a place to improve mental health on like a stress relieving walk, but of course, the benefits to the flood adaptation that we're talking about. Next slide. Unfortunately, many places where communities have begun to do this kind of voluntary retreat, we find that remaining vacant lands become oftentimes overgrown and distressed looking, causing blight in communities. And they're found where they're found. They tend to be burdensome even to steward by the local municipalities. And they then impact the desire for many communities to actually want buyouts to occur, as the people remaining there don't necessarily want to be left with an eyesore surrounding them or the increased cost of maintenance. And so we've been thinking about this issue for quite a bit of time, and how do we work with that adaptation hierarchy that we're thinking about while also doing work in communities equitably. And so we spent months as a team trying to figure out how we could do this work with a finite budget, limited team capacity, limited geographic range, and really not that much power to influence communities as individuals on the teams in our own right, which I'm sure many of you experienced. So we actually kept these things in mind and decided to take the route of creating an RFP or a request for proposals to do a visioning project for communities to think about what they want these vacant lands to look like, or how they would like them to be repurposed after they've been bought out post-flood event. And so we use this process mainly so that we weren't the ones picking the communities. We thought it would be more equitable for communities to self-select, but in many ways we learned that the RFP process can also be inequitable. And with this recognition, we tried to take the power that we did have to really shift the RFP process that we were releasing in order to make as many communities have the ability to apply. Next slide. So
4
this
minutes
slide,
left, Shamika.
5?
4, but
okay. So this slide is really the basis of this kind of talk right here. And it's how we shifted from going from this really long standard RFP process to something that's a little bit more concise and shorter. So we started off by actually having guiding principles, which in the next slide, you don't need to change yet. You'll see a list of them. I did not list them all out here because there are a handful, but they range from anything such as ensuring that resources are shared equitably among organizations, to ensuring that Indigenous communities and environmental justice and frontline populations are included and represented in the conversations, as well as hiring from the community whenever possible. And again, you'll see all of these guidelines on the next page. But those were really kind of the metrics that we wanted folks to go off of based on the design we thought people should have in terms of the community engagement. We also developed a list of consultants that if the community or the municipality didn't have the ability to do work in a very deep, meaningful way, they could actually partner with consultant firms who do that work and who are comfortable with community engagement work and have the capacity to do so, to apply. We also made sure that we had flexibility in funding. And so while the funding was finite, we did, after the communities were selected, go back to the project teams and ensure that we were offering more money if they needed it, because we know that a lot of project teams may lowball their budgets based on trying to be more competitive. We also started off with a pre-proposal, which was just a one-page kind of interest form, just to let communities or organizations with limited capacity have the ability to let us know they were interested without having to go through the traditional proposal process. We gave them a month to do that one page. And then the rest of the proposal process was really just additional information to support that initial pre-proposal. We also made sure that we had flexible funding to have communities members paid, including artists in the community and the photographers who would be at the engagement events, as well as the leaders from the community that would be facilitating conversations. And we provided funding to create a short documentary film that the communities can use to talk about their visioning work. Next slide. So
about 1 minute left.
Too deeply. Next slide. I'm not going to go too deeply into who we picked and the exact projects that they did. But we also had a mentorship component where we paired the awarded communities with those that were not awarded, so that the ones that were not awarded could learn how they could actually do this community engagement work around the managed retreat a little bit better in their communities. Next slide. And we based the mentorship program on geography, similarity in demographics, as well as socioeconomic conditions. Final slide. And so really the communities now are in a position where they have a vision plan that is mostly agreed on by a lot of the community members that they can get and shop around, edit, use for granting opportunities, as well as the ability for community members who hadn't been necessarily in conversation with each other now to be more in conversation with one another, to continue advocating with each other on behalf of these plans. Last slide. And as we were talking about this conversation and what we were really thinking about, some of the principles that this project was hitting, we're thinking about safeguarding people. Recognizing context was really important for the communities that we were in. Thinking in systems was something that we really needed to focus on because we knew we couldn't handle all aspects of the project. So how do we make sure that folks have the support that they need to continue doing this proposal, but then the implementation work after? And then, of course, the equitable distribution of costs and benefits. And I'm sure there are others that folks heard in this, but as we were talking about this in prep for this conversation, these are the 4 that really stood out. And I'll stop here to allow for us to get some questions and answers. But again, I do want to thank everyone for being here today and for listening to both Stephen and myself.
Thank you so much, Shamika. That was wonderful.